This week is about rebuilding, when to rebuild, how to move from rebuilding to competing, very important, players to target when rebuilding, and trades that rebuilding teams made in actual leagues. Welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. My name is Justin, joined live synchronously by my co-hosts David and JP. We're at full strength this week. It is a good feeling. David, I know you're happy to be back. Hopefully, all of you feel the same as well. We already said this week is about rebuilding. We won't go into productive struggle in this episode. However, we do have a short form video coming out about the productive struggle strategy in startups later this week. So keep an eye out for that. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on it. So, with all that being said, David, will you start us out with our listener community question? And can you give people a little bit of information about just what the community question is? Because we want to make sure all of our listeners know you can have your responses read on next week's episode as well.
Yeah, sure. So this was kind of an idea we had in development for this show that was meant to shine a spotlight back on the community. We certainly don't think we're perfect at this game. We think we can all learn from each other. So we kind of selfishly wanted to learn from you guys, but also give you an opportunity to get your responses read on the show. So we thought this was kind of a cool idea. So please reply. We'd love to read your thoughts. We'd love to get your thoughts out there and talk about them. But last week's question: how do you decide when it is time to rebuild? What types of factors are most important for you when evaluating and making this choice? So, JP, you want to go ahead and read our first response?
Our first response is from Trev Bob here. He says, "You kind of know when it's time to rebuild. Hard to admit sometimes. But if you have to squint and be like, well, if these rookies become top 12, my vets have a throwback type of season, if we are realistic, you aren't going to win. So, do you want to get the 108 or sell some vets and get up to a top four pick and have ability to get some new elite assets or trade for them? So, basically, if you have to dream up outcomes for your players to just sneak into the playoffs, just rebuild. I think he's on the right track. I mean, I think if you're looking at the realistic shot of making the playoffs, that's a great starting point. If there's like a 50% chance you're going to make the playoffs, you may want to start consider rebuilding at that point. But yeah, we're going to dive deeper into that. And David, you want to read our next response?
Sure. From a longtime friend of the show, Awesome Dumpling says, I'm hoping to learn more about this from you guys. To me, I think it's got to be based on league context. Does your team have the ability to compete with the best teams? Is the market set up in a way where you can gain more value for older players? Things like that. Those are very good observations, good thoughts to start your process, and we'll kind of expand on those here in a little bit. Justin, you want to go ahead with yours?
Yeah, and last response we got here from K Cluda. Well, from the one league I'm in, the answer to the community question is that most people don't know if they're to rebuild or not, and maybe they need outside eyes to tell them if they are or not. And that can be very true. Like, it can be very difficult to be honest with yourself. I know Trav has been playing a bit. He has a lot of leagues that he's in, so he has a lot of experience in knowing that. But people who haven't seen too many years of Dynasty experience aren't in as many leagues. Sometimes it's hard because you can squint with rose-colored glasses and see. Honestly, a lot of the time I will straight up ask these guys, like, should I be pushing in or not? Should I be rebuilding? Like, I ask these guys for advice on that because we always want to squint, right? If you feel like you're close, it's easy to try to push in because you can win money if you win, right? And you can't win money if you're rebuilding. So we always have that inclination to want to do it. So sometimes a impartial opinion on, like, is this realistic or am I lying to myself, is a really great way to go. And my thoughts on this, I wanted to go first because David's gone first the last few times, and I wanted to make it so you didn't have to work quite as hard today. With me, the most important thing for this question, and this only is unless I own it, because if I own your future first, you don't need to get it back. But otherwise, do not rebuild if you don't own your future first. The very first thing you need to do before you even sell a single asset is figure out, can I get this first back? And that person who has your first is going to give you a little bit of a hard time about it. They know they have you in a little bit of a pickle. They're going to try to sell it back to you as an early first. You really have to convince them to sell it back to you as a mid first. you're not gonna be able to buy it as a late first in almost any league. No one's gonna be that gullible to say like, "Oh, I want my first back, but I still am competing." Like, people kinda know what's up. So that's the very first thing is get your first back or it's not time to rebuild, in my opinion. Kinda the exception is once you reach week, like, 10, 11, and you know you're already out of the playoffs, at that point, I don't mind dumping, like, aging running backs and wide receivers, but even then, like, a player like a Chris Godwin type, I might not even wanna sell at that point just because I think they're still gonna be a usable asset next year, and honestly, they're probably still worth a second, maybe a second and a third next year like they are now. They're not gonna be worth a first at any point, so, really, if you own your first, that's pretty much the number one thing. After that, I really do like to kinda, like, get a whole snapshot of the league. We've talked a lot about this. Dynasty-Daddy is a great website to go to. We'll link it in the episode description below, but if you go there, we've walked through, we'll also link this episode in the bottom where we talk about targeting future firsts, and you can look at a league snapshot. So that video is in the description below. You can look and see if you're a contender or not based on their rankings. You can look at the starter rankings. So this is what Awesome Dumpling was talking about. Look at the league context. I want to be one of the top 2 or 3 teams, and I want it to be very obvious I'm one of the top 2 or 3 teams. Otherwise, I'm already starting to consider one of 2 things, rebuilding or retooling if I don't think that there's a really high, like 80% chance that I'm gonna get a buy. And then the only exception to that is if I'm very young. If I have this, like, incredibly sleek, sexy bikini dynasty value team, like, you have Malik Neighbors and you have Marvin Harrison Jr., and you're squinting that these guys are gonna break out and both be top 12 wide receivers, and then I'm competing, and that could happen. I don't mind being mid if I have this really wonderful young core of players because I would rather not sell core assets off of that team. I would just see, can I get into the playoffs and just hope that they're peaking at the right time? Maybe buy a running back at the trade deadline, as I'm hoping these wide receivers do better in the second half. So I'm okay with that build as well. Anything else, I'm usually trying to move towards like the bottom 3 teams, potentially towards the 101. If I'm not kind of in that sexy young team, or if I don't have kind of a close to a super team, I'm usually starting to visit the idea of rebuilding or at the very least a retool.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify for the listeners real quick. I think you said you wanted like an 80% chance at a buy. I was checking on one of my best teams in Dynasty Daddy the other day. It's even a 10-team league where, your probability to get a buy is a little higher than in a 12. That team has a 71% chance at a buy. I really don't know how I could get to 80. You're just picking a number to illustrate your point there, right? Not actually a bar that you strive to achieve.
I'm just that much better than you, David. No, yeah, of course, I'm talking in hyperbole here. 80% means with the rose-colored glasses, but realistically speaking, like, there's a lot of attrition in fantasy football. I just want it to be that if I asked, 10 people, all 10 people would say, "Yeah, you're definitely gonna make the playoffs with this type of roster." Like, I don't see that happening, and there's a very good chance you get the bye, like, type of a team. You would need the apocalypse to happen to this team, which always could happen, but yeah, you are right there. And JP, what are your thoughts on this community question?
So I want to touch on orphans real quick because if you do take over an orphan, a lot of times I'm going to rebuild on that orphan because I want to change the roster construction to the way I see is optimal. And usually when you take over an orphan, like let's be honest, it's not going to be like a super team or a team that's top 3 in value on Keep Trade Cut or Dynasty Daddy. And yeah, Keep Trade Cut, that's another tool you can use. You just plug in your league ID and it kind of just gives lay of the land of value wise, which teams hold the most value just according to Keep Trade Cut rankings and all that. So I just want to touch on that with an orphan. But in a 12-team league, if my team shows I'm outside of the top 6 to 8 teams in terms of value, then that means I'm probably going to start rebuilding that season because, like Justin said, I want to be pretty confident that my team is pretty strong. Otherwise, I do like the idea of rebuilding because you can turn things around in just 1 year. Because obviously, you're going to want to get some of the higher rookies coming in. You're going to want to gain some value across the season. All the things we say, get the backup quarterbacks, backup running backs. You sell them and you get picks throughout the year. And that's going to go a long way to gaining a lot of value. Obviously, I'm not going to be targeting these kind of players like Tyreek Hill, CMC, Devontae Adams, Kelsey, those players. I'm going to move off of them unless there's one scenario where I'm not top, 6 in terms of value. There are some teams that do have those players like Tyreek, CMC, Devontae, Kelsey. They're just going out with one last hurrah. I will ride it out one more year, if I think that I have a strong chance there because you can still get some elite guys that aren't top 2, 3 round startup picks just because they're so old. But otherwise, yeah, I'm going to rebuild if I don't love my chances at making the playoffs, especially if I don't think I have a chance of getting a bye.
And just on that, if you take over an orphan, I always like to look at it as I get 1 year free to rebuild most of the time because the dues are usually paid for this year, so it kinda makes it a little bit easier for me to do that as well. David, what's your answer to the question?
Yeah, so kinda like you were saying at the top of your answer, Justin, the first step is, do I have my rookie pick for next year? Do I have my first round pick? And if I don't, can I get it back cheap? If I don't have my first round pick and I can't get it, I'm probably not gonna straight rebuild. I might retool, but most of the value you get from rebuilding is increasing your draft positioning. So if you don't have access to your draft picks, it's kind of difficult to have a successful rebuild. Another general tip is you got to be honest with yourself. You know, Justin, you were mentioning sometimes you like to ask other people to look at your roster, give you an unbiased opinion. That's a great strategy. But if you are going to decide for yourself, really go for thinking about median outcomes for your players, not high end outcomes. If you need to rely on too many high end outcomes for your team to be competitive, you're probably not competitive, kind of like Trav Bob was saying. So if I do have my picks and I want to rebuild, the first thing I'm going to do, we mentioned this in the community question responses as well, start comparing yourself to the best, one or two, maybe three teams in the league. And do you have the ability to compete with them? Not are you better than them or anything? It's a long season, a lot can happen. Do you stack up well with them where you could see a reasonable chance of actually beating them? If not, maybe not time to start competing. Another thing to look for is how many hammers do you have? How many people can win you a week on your team? The number that I want depends on not just league settings, but also how those top teams in my league stack up. So those two kind of inform each other. And the next thing is how close am I to optimal roster construction, at least for my personal process. This is a good way not only to evaluate the depth of your team, but the high end talent. Do you have the pieces in place that you can actually compete, or are you close enough that you can fill in the blanks as needed? And then the other thing, how many other teams are already starting to collect future firsts and how many do they have? You're probably not going to be able to pry those first off guys that are rebuilding. So if, seven of them are collected on two teams, it's going to be hard for you to get those other four. Kind of look ahead. If you're not one of the first to try and rebuild in that year, it's going to be difficult. So you want to be the early bird in this situation if you can. And if you're not, maybe again, maybe you just retool like if you didn't have access to your first. Those are kind of the tips that I use when trying to decide if I want to rebuild. So JP, you want to go ahead and read next week's community question for us?
Next week's question is, what kind of moves are you trying to make during these slow months, and what are you trying to avoid doing? And Justin, where can the community respond?
Yeah, so you can, of course, if you're watching on YouTube, reply in those comments below. Really appreciate the responses, guys. We're trying to learn from and with you. You can email us at dinoconstructionff@gmail.com or at dinoconff on X. Also, our personal Twitter handles in the episode description below. If you engage with us, ask us trade questions in the comments or on X. We will also always reply to all of those. So, really love when you engage with us, whether about the community question or anything else, guys. So, moving on from our community question, we are going to go into the general rebuild strategy. Now, we've talked about how to recognize when you should be rebuilding. Now, we're going to talk about how to rebuild. And this time, we're going to have JP start us off with an overview of your rebuild strategy or strategery. I just love George Bush.
Yeah, when I'm rebuilding, obviously one of the goals is to get, the 101, 102 in the upcoming rookie draft. So I'm going to want to do three things in a rebuild. The first thing is I'm going to sell players that are likely to lose value in the next year or so, which are typically going to be the old guys or someone that we think has a pretty good chance of losing their starting job, this time next year. Secondly, I want to target assets that I believe can or will gain value year over year, or guys who could spike in value mid-season. I want to roster young players, collect a lot of rookie picks, of course, and hold those backup running backs and quarterbacks to sell, for those second and third round picks in season. And lastly, I want to shed as many points as reasonably possible without making my team too bad to compete next season. But the best way to do this, I think, is just to hold zero starting running backs. If you're in a start 10, you got two starting running back positions. If you're getting nearly no points from those running backs, then you're already going to be around 20% ish, fewer points than the rest of your league mates every single week. Yeah, it just makes sense to eliminate that because obviously the running backs have the shortest shelf life. And the backup running backs, like I said, they spike in value from an injury, which injuries happen all the time at the running back position. So you got a pretty good chance of having a sell window on a backup running back.
Yeah, a lot of those concepts we covered in our RB strategy for roster construction definitely applies here and agree with you. David, how do you approach this?
Yeah, so my first tip I think is pretty important to remember. It's that winning is more fun than collecting value and losing. Winning money is more fun than losing money. So don't get distracted by, the shiny object in front of you and end up rebuilding longer than you have to. While there are exceptions, I typically aim for a 1-year rebuild, and I think that's almost always doable. Just kind of depends on your league market.
Yeah, and we'll definitely touch on that later. In fact, our next section is gonna be how to turn these rebuilders into contenders. Really important point, David.
Just to kind of piggyback off that, I don't want it to come off like I'm saying I need to flip it into a favorite or anything. I don't need you to look at it and say, "Hey, I'm probably going to have a bye week," like you were talking about earlier, Justin. It can be one of those young teams that's kind of mid, but I want to have a decent shot at the playoffs, and I want to have some assets to address needs if it looks like I'm competing. That's kind of the goal. I think it's also pretty important to recognize the time of year that you're doing this. You're deciding mid-season, you want to be the first one to start selling if you can. If you're late to the party, like I kind of mentioned, all the good stuff might be gone. Just try and be honest with yourself again. And then when you do decide to sell, if you can get those fringe contenders first, that's awesome because there's so much variance and they're typically the ones that are trying to be aggressive to buy in to give themselves a better shot. And then if you're rebuilding in the off season, I try to make this decision as quickly as I can, but definitely before the rookie drafts. And that's because while rookie picks in that year's draft are nice to get, they're young players with upside. You have to make a pick there before any game starts. The pick becomes a lot riskier for a rebuilder. So I try to get future picks. It keeps you more fluid. I almost pay the same price for future firsts as I would for this year's first, even though the value is a little different in the market.
Yeah, and I think on that point, a lot of the time you can get them a little bit cheaper. And more importantly, off of what JP was saying earlier too, I've never ever once gotten any points towards my max points for from a future pick, but I have from players. So if you can turn like a Brian Thomas Jr., for example, someone at like the 110, Lad McConkey, like a 110, 111 in this year's draft into a 25 first on a like known rebuilder, you have two benefits, right? You don't have to worry about them flopping. Sure, you might lose a little bit of ceiling outcome, but heck, that first could potentially be the 101 as well. So you don't necessarily lose ceiling outcome and you don't improve your points for, therefore decreasing the value of your future pick. So I think that's a really great point, David.
Yeah, and so the next thing I'll do is before I start selling, I want to identify any core players that I have that I feel I can build around. I have some good young quarterbacks, wide receivers, maybe a tight end. I'm not exactly looking to sell those players, and I know they'll give me the biggest return, which is kind of like keeping your eyes on the shiny prize rather than the goal. I want to keep my core together because it helps me in keeping that rebuild to 1 year. If I have known production that I'm building around, it's a lot easier to be competing next year than it is if you're just taking so many gambles. They don't always pay off. So if I do trade a core player, most of the time I want to be getting another one in return. But if I'm not getting one in return, it's just got to be such a great deal with the value. Nobody's untouchable, but just keep in mind who you're trying to build around and who's expendable. And then once I've identified my core, it's time to sell, baby. I want as many future draft picks as possible. And if I am taking a player, they've got to have high upside or be someone that I think could give me a spike week and an opportunity to sell. When it comes to the more valuable assets, I'm going to spend a little time scouting other teams looking for who might actually want this player, who might be a good fit to trade with. So I'll spend a little time negotiating that. But for most of the players, I'm just going to decide on a price and I'm going to spam offers. If you're okay with a future second for this guy, go offer that player to everyone with a future second. Now, I generally do this one player at a time. I think you can probably do maybe two, maybe three, but don't spam everyone with like 5 offers of random guys for a third or something. That gets kind of annoying. But another trick here is you can always, at least in Sleeper, I'm not sure about other formats. In Sleeper, you can set a nickname for a player. So you can set like a buy now price. This guy I'll take for any future first, any future second, whatever. I like that strategy, but I also see that it's not the most successful. So I do still recommend sending out offers if you're going to do that, just to make sure that you're trying to initiate conversations.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of doing the former where you send out the trade offers to everyone rather than the auto accept trade block. I've definitely found it's probably because I'm annoying that people ignore my nicknames in the chat. I've gotten some comments from people like, "Oh, I didn't even see that you put them at this price," after like I then sent out the trade offers. Like I would have accepted this a month ago. Like I've had people tell me like, but I don't pay attention to the nicknames, but they do get the notification when you actually send the trade. So you nickname the running back any third, no offers. You send it to 11 teams for 25 or 26 thirds, it's a lot more likely to get accepted. And then I've had some conversations. In fact, I was talking with one of our listeners, Awesome Dumpling, about that concept of, yeah, like I gave him like a list of 5 or 6 players on his team that I thought he should send out for any third, but I gave him that same advice, David, of if you have the time, if you have the patience to send out this wide receiver today, this wide receiver in the next couple days, and like pace it out over a little bit of time, I do think you do see better results than if you send all 5 players for any third at the same time because it's spams. Maybe that's a little anecdotal, but I do know that if I get those trade offers and I get 5 at once, like, I just feel a little bit like, this guy's just trying to clean his trash. But, like, if it's just, like, a single one, I think it comes off as a little bit more appealing. So, that being said, like, you are better off sending out all 5 in one day than only sending out none of them. So, if it's the best you can do and you know you're not gonna send them out otherwise, and you're just gonna sit down and do it once, it's probably still better. And then one really important thing I do wanna just talk about with the rebuild strategy and how to rebuild is going for the 101. So, I stole this section from David's show notes here, this topic just because he had so much, and I just wanted to talk about something as well, because David is just the most studious of all of us. And I do think it's really important to not get too much tunnel vision on getting the 101. I have noticed teams hamstringing themselves where they go into a 2 or 3 year rebuild because they sell so much focusing on getting the 101, and sometimes they don't even get full value, and they're just like, "It's okay, I'll rebuild for 2 or 3 years." There is almost never a time that I feel like I need to rebuild for multiple years. Sure, it can happen, but for the most part, you don't want to sell too many core pieces like David said. I'd rather have the 103 than the 101 if I'd have to lose quite a bit of value getting down there, right? I'm not looking to sell young cornerstone productive pieces. Like, I'm never gonna move like a Justin Jefferson or a CD Lamb type of player unless I'm getting a absolute haul for them. I don't care if they're max points for take me up to the 103. I want that cornerstone asset unless I'm getting like 3.5 or 4 firsts of value. So I do think that's a really big key, and make sure to pay attention to how your league determines draft order, right? Is it max points for? I hope so, because I think that's way superior. Or is it record? Because if it is max points for, look into like how best ball scoring is kind of done, because that's what max points for is. And just know that you don't want to roster lots and lots of wide receivers that are fringe wide receivers who can boom, because that hurts your max points for. So just understanding if it's max points for or if it is based on record is really important. And then I think we've already hit on a lot of the general strategy of no running backs, like you said. That's key. Young wide receivers, young QBs. I do want to avoid too many risky players. I want to keep my risk appetite a little bit lower because if you have all risky players, I do think that we can start to see where sure you could boom, but you could also find your way into a 3 year rebuild if you go all boom bust like rookie prospects as well.
One additional thing I'd like to add here is if you're rebuilding correctly, your first isn't your only shot at the 101. Every additional first you add gives you an additional chance at that 101. So you don't necessarily have to focus on how you can get the 101 with your draft pick. Just take more dart throws at that pick.
Yeah, sometimes there are those teams that you can see a year or two in advance that this team, okay, they're going to be really bad in a year or two. I did that in one league where the guy had Justin Fields and Desmond Ritter as his starting quarterbacks, and I was like, well, he might not have a starting quarterback here in a year, and that paid off pretty nicely. At least it seems to be on that path. Before we move into how to turn a rebuild into a contender, we're going to look at players that we think are good to target in a rebuild. Of course, they're going to fit along the guidelines that we've illustrated previously here. But David, tell us about the guys that you're looking to add to your rebuilding roster.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not too player take heavy, but if I am targeting a specific player in a rebuild, they generally fit into at least one of these three boxes. First one is if it's a core player, which we brought up a few times. You always want to be adding those guys anyways. But especially if I don't yet have a strong core, then that's kind of what I'm targeting. I'm looking for chances to use the assets I've collected to buy one or two until I'm happy with the size of my core that I'm building around. Another player I like to target high young upside players. Like Justin said, we don't want to have too much risk on our teams, but you want to have some because if you hit on these highly volatile players, it can really help speed up your rebuild. Rookie quarterbacks are pretty good examples of that. Several rookie wide receivers fit into that. Lad McConkey, Keon Coleman, Xavier Leggett, Jalen Polk. The list goes on. These guys all have a realistic shot of leading their team in targets, not just this year, but for the future. And the last thing is someone who's currently injured. I am happy to let that person gain their value on my bench while not scoring any points. It's kind of the perfect situation for a rebuilder, actually. So this year, I'm thinking of TJ Hawkinson, essentially. There's other players that fit it too, but I'm going to let him sit on my bench. I'm going to let him recover. He might have a few weeks where he's struggling as he's proving he's healthy, as he's figuring out his new quarterback. That's fine. Once he proves he's healthy and he's a stud again, he's going to have gained value from where I bought him, and it's gonna give me a chance to sell him. Or in his case, he's only gonna be 27 next year. He could be my tight end 1 going forward. I have options in that situation, though, and I believe they're both better than the situation where I'm buying him at right now.
And I'm gonna kind of rebut, one of those points, and that's sort of the Rome Odunze type of a player. I understand I'm a little bit lower on Odunze than you guys simply because of I don't think his situation is great. I think there's a lot of the JSN type of arc. I do think he's probably a better NFL prospect than JSN is simply because he has the ability to play more of that prototypical X type of wide receiver. However, I do think that the amount of target competition that there is with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore, that I don't think he's going to produce incredibly well this year. He was my wide receiver sell in our wide receiver sell video. And I want to avoid players who I think just are not going to have the ability to produce because we are so reactionary as dynasty players. So another example of a rookie I want to avoid would be like a Michael Penix. Even in a rebuild, I typically don't want him because I don't think he's going to go up in value. I think he's only going to decrease in value. So if we see players where you can identify they don't have a path to production whatsoever, usually I want to avoid those types of players. So that's just a general like avoid. And then as far as trades for, I want to just go a different route than like targeting like just specific players. So first of all, I always want to trade for future firsts. That's not always possible. So then I want to evaluate wide receivers because what are running backs? We don't even believe in them if we're rebuilding. I want to target wide receivers who I think are going to be worth a first next year that I can turn a first worth of value. So think like a Devonte Adams and maybe like a RB3 type of guy, like Devonte Adams and like Devin Singletary. If I could turn like those guys who I think I could make an argument with the team, maybe I should get a first for that type of player, or like a Cooper Cup and Devin Singletary type of package. And I can turn it into someone like a T. Higgins or another wide receiver in like the wide receiver 24 to like 30 range that I think will hold some value. Even though we don't love Jordan Addison because people are low on him, I might be willing to go there, or even like a JSN who I'm not high on. Because if you can't get a future first and you're going to lose value from these players, then I do think that sometimes getting a wide receiver that we think is going to hold in that future first value range is a trade target that I want to make. So again, I do actually really like T. Higgins. If I do have to pick a player, he would just be the one. And I did have Hawkinson on here as well because of the same reasons David said. For T. Higgins, the reason I like him just narratively is simply because he's either going to get a new deal and players spike when they get new deals, or he's going to be in a new place. And when he goes to a new place and he finally gets that narrative, we're going to love that narrative. So I guess just on that general note, you can always look at contract year players as well as a potential target spike. So in general, if you go on, I think it's pronounced Spot Track. If you go look at people's contract situation, you see that their contract is coming up, you believe in the talent, they're either going to A, get a new contract, in which case their price will probably go up, or B, be in a new place that's exciting, in which case you have another sell window. So that's probably another direction I'm very willing to go as well.
Kind of just to expand on the Romo Dunze conversation, because I think you're referring to him as being a core player that I would target. I understand what you're saying, where he may drop in value, you may be able to get him cheaper next year. But at the same time, he's someone I believe in as a prospect. I think he's in a good situation long term, and he fits my vision going forward as someone who I think should explode next year. So while he's not off limits or anything like that, he's not someone I'm trying to actively move because I do think he fits my future plans so well.
Like you said, Justin, you're the one who's a little bit lower on the Dunze. I just think the difference for me with JSN is I think he's more of that guy like Keenan Allen who needs to have the targets to be productive. And he was, in the number two or number three wide receiver. And I think Adunze, I think that he's got the big play downfield ability and that touchdown upside to where he doesn't need to be a guy that gets, 140 targets to be like highly productive. So I think he's going to show some more flashes that will get some people excited. But I'm not certain that it's a slam dunk that he doesn't at least decrease in value in some way. So I can understand your perspective on that as well. I got two players here that I wanted to highlight, and I knew that we weren't really going to talk about running backs because I know who my co-hosts are, and I'm not a big running back guy either. Of course, we talked about running backs through this entire episode, how they're just not great to hold in a rebuild, but we mentioned backups are, and I got two guys here, and they are young. They appear to be a backup, and they have at least a case to be a starter next year. And the first one I want to talk about is Marshawn Lloyd. He's a great running back target, I think, because he was a day two running back. He's got a great speed score at the 93rd percentile at 220 pounds. So I do think he's got upside to be a great running back, especially a workhorse guy at 220 pounds. And I think he's going to flash that big playability even as a backup because Matt LaFleur, we've seen he's always been a guy who has had a committee. Even when he had Derrick Henry in Tennessee, he was using Dion Lewis way more than he needed to. But if Josh Jacobs gets hurt, and that offense, it's a great offense. He might be like a top 12 running back for 2 or 3 weeks or something. And in that scenario, you might be able to sell him for something like I send out Lloyd in a second and I get a first back potentially if people are getting all excited and juiced about the potential. And part of the reason why people will be excited is because if he does look great, he might be the starter next year because Josh Jacobs, he got a 4 year deal, but he can be cut after this season. So I think that they might be inclined to do that if they do like what they see from Lloyd and Josh Jacobs continues to be inefficient, like we've seen him be all but 1 year in his career, essentially. So yeah, that's why I like to target Marshawn Lloyd because he's not going to give me all those points. And another guy is Jalen Wright. This is another rookie running back. I think rookie running backs in particular are good targets in general on a rebuild. You get the benefit of not having the fantasy points in your starting lineup, as I mentioned, contributing to your max points for. And he's seemingly the RB3 on that team, right? They got Mostert and Achan. But I think he could have a huge role if either Achan or Mostert gets injured. So I think he's got two injury outs because honestly, you know how they are with that running back room. Achan and Mostert were both great. And we know that Jalen Wright is also explosive. He had a 95th percentile speed score and burst score. And this is one of the most fantasy friendly running back rooms in the entire NFL. He had one of the best yards per carry in the SEC coming out. And he's really, really young, too. He turned 21 the same month as the draft, actually. We all heard Braylon Allen super young, which he is younger, but Jalen Wright was extremely young as well. Mostert is 11 years older than Jalen Wright. So I think that there's a good chance that Mostert is gone after this season, potentially. Maybe Mostert just hits, that age cliff this year and Jalen Wright sees a bigger role that way. I just think there's a lot of routes that Jalen Wright could potentially, second half of the year have a strong role. And also, I don't, I don't really see them sticking with Mostert after this season.
Can't disagree with that analysis. Now, what is the process that we're looking to go to get those guys? I guess one thing that comes to mind might be, would you try to like tear down off of a veteran and get one of these guys in like a third or something like that? Or like what's the process?
Yeah, I think that is a great route to go. I think these guys in general were probably third round rookie picks, early to mid. So I wouldn't mind inquiring and say, hey, I'll send you a third next year because I think that this class was strong. And if I can get an early third guy who has this potential to spike in value and potential to be a starter next year, I wouldn't mind sending a third next year as long as it's not mine because I'm obviously rebuilding in this scenario here.
So, JP, I'm just going to give you a quick little rapid fire and tell me if you would take one of these two players and a third for the following names: Elvin Kamara, if you're rebuilding.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe even get a tad bit more, but yeah, I think I would say get the points off my roster, get the youth in there,
Brian Robinson,
100%.
Javante Williams.
I definitely would consider it because Javante, he's one of those guys I mentioned. He could be out of a starting job next year.
Yeah, so just kinda like that range, I'm looking at, like, kind of the late RB20s, early RB30s that we could potentially see the ability to do some of that, so that is definitely an option we could look at going. Just wanted to give some general trade advice there on how to maybe target in such a way we don't wanna necessarily try to offer a second for these guys, right? And you might not be able to get them for a third, so the option might be tearing down from a veteran RB for the youth. So now that we have gotten our targets out of the way, we're going to move on to how do we try to turn these rebuilders into a competing team. It's definitely fun to rebuild, but we don't want to do it forever. David, what do you look for to know you're ready to compete?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this does depend on your league settings, so definitely adjust accordingly. And then, if I'm being completely honest, the league buy-in plays a big role for me. I don't like rebuilding too long in higher buy-in leagues because you're just wasting more money. But I might be a little more patient with smaller buy-in leagues. Where do you draw that line is very subjective, and it's up to you and your level of buy-ins. And then I also want to make this decision early in the off season, so I have as much time as possible to get my roster where I want it.
And I'm gonna let you finish, but when I saw your show notes, I just kind of want to interrupt at this early in the off-season point. Now, I know you're gonna give some more parameters on what you want to have to make the shift from competing to rebuilding, but in the early off season, I really like to start to try to make a few low risk bets personally when I'm coming off of a rebuild, where I will aim for players, especially kind of more like veteran RBs. They can be second year vet RBs, but just running backs who there's murky situations that I can get in the early third or late second round of rookie pick value range. So this year I was targeting a bit of Zamir White for like 209, 210, 211 before Josh Jacobs left. Last year, players I was targeting for kind of a late second type of price in some leagues where I could get them. And if I can't get them, I'm not going to overpay. Where Pacheco or Rashad White, when people thought they're going to draft somebody for sure, for sure. Of course, you could also have missed on people like a Damian Pierce last year. So this is risky, and that's why I don't want to be buying the guys that cost a first or even an early second. But if you can make these type of bets early in the offseason coming off of a rebuild, you know before your rookie draft if it's hit because the NFL draft has happened. You know, has this guy survived the landmines? And now you know, do I have a guy that's a starter that I got at a really cheap price? So this kind of a cheap strategic bet is just something I wanted to throw in that I kind of like to almost help me make the decision. Not that I'm going to automatically like start competing, but maybe I just made a profit and now I just try to sell Zamir White if I still evaluate how you're going to evaluate and say I can't, but just a little bit of insight I wanted to give in. Unless you guys disagree with doing that in moderation. David, what other factors are you looking for besides just can you get lucky on Zamir White?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good part of the process. I would argue that it's a good part of the process, basically, no matter what situation you're in. But especially if you're trying to get a little extra motivation to turn a rebuilder into a competitor, those are great things to look at. For me, here are the non-negotiables that I have. If you've been watching The Bear, non-negotiables has come up a lot. I've been watching that season. Great show. If you've never heard of it, check it out. So I need a strong core. I've talked about my core a lot. I want to be comfortable with my quarterback position specifically, and I want to make sure I have enough wide receivers. And then I want to make sure I have enough assets to buy some missing pieces throughout the season and the off season. And typically those assets are draft capital, but sometimes if I have like a third elite quarterback or if I'm really deep at wide receiver, I can consider those expendable assets as well. One of the other things I like to see is my roster construction pretty much where I want it. That's something I mentioned earlier. Another thing I mentioned earlier is how many hammers do I have? If I have a couple on here already, that gets me a little closer to where I want to be. Do I have a stud tight end? Are they part of my core? Or do I just have like maybe Evan Ingram? And then I kind of mentioned this in my non negotiables, but I do want some extra draft capital so that I can fill in as the season goes along. So after that, kind of in my experience personally, this is kind of anecdotal. My first step has almost always been buying an elite asset. Typically, when I'm in this situation, it's going from a productive struggle to a contender. So for me, that basically means I probably don't have JJ or Chase, CD, one of those guys, because I've focused on quarterback early. So for me, it's trying to get one of those guys if I can. Maybe it's a tight end like Laporta or McBride. I'm typically missing someone that I want who is both a hammer and a core piece. And if I can acquire that in one person, that really helps me move forward. If I can't, I want to see, do I have enough hammers to compete? If not, can I get a guy like Tyreek Hill for cheap because it's not the point scoring season? If it's like a Mike Evans or something, just someone who I can count on reliably for points week to week and has, week winning upside. The last move for me personally, whether, you're doing what Justin has suggested, or maybe you listen to JP and you bought a couple of guys last season or something, I'm trying to build my running back room last. There's no rush in it in the off season. You're not playing games for a while. As you get closer to the season, maybe you get a little more aggressive. But I'm still reaching out. I'm trying to get some good deals. I'm trying to see what the market is like. And then, once I'm committed to rebuilding, I might get a little more aggressive. I'm starting to pull the trigger on some of these guys. But again, I'm being patient, but that is the last step. And then I'll just mention this again. I said it at the top, but I don't need to make a title favorite. I just want to be able to compete and have the assets to push in later if it looks like I am competing. And then you don't need to make every first round pick that you've acquired. You don't need to take them all into the season. My productive struggle in our Megala Dynasty, I had 5 first round picks and I went into the next season with none of them on my team. And I won the championship that year. And it wasn't just mortgaging guys for the future. It wasn't just buying studs that are veterans. I think I bought like Josh Allen, Jamar Chase. I used other pieces in these deals too. It wasn't just my first. but it was targeting those core players that are also hammers, and that really helped propel me to the championship.
Yeah, hammers are really, really important. I know a lot of teams after 1 year of a rebuild, they have a lot of guys like Michael Pittman, Devonta Smith, JSN, a lot of guys like that, and they don't have any hammers. And it makes a huge difference. To illustrate this point, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, these guys, they averaged over 23 fantasy points per game last year. And you might have Michael Pittman, and you're like, oh, heck yeah, I got my wide receiver two alongside of like somebody like DK Metcalf. But Michael Pittman, he finished what wide receiver? It was 13 last year in PPR, but he had 15 points compared to over 23. It's a big gap. So those teams that you're competing against that have Tyreek Hill and they have Jamar Chase, you're so far behind. And wide receiver is one of the positions that they're consistently scoring. They're giving you boom weeks and they're giving you consistency with a floor. So you have to go get those guys. The hammers are really really important. But yeah, after a rebuild, obviously I was gaining a lot of value. That's the whole point of the rebuild. I want to transition when I know for sure, like Justin said, I want to make sure I got an 80% chance at a top two seed, something along those lines. I want to feel like I am a top 3 or 4 team in the league within the season. I want to have a chance at that 1 or 2 seed because that gives you a huge, huge advantage. There's so many times when the number 3 or 4 seed loses in the Megala Dynasty. Oh my gosh. 2 teams barely slipped into the playoffs. I had their picks. I was like, all right, I probably got the 107, 108, but they beat the teams that were the third and fourth seed that were much better than them all season long. It's just 1 week can really, really screw you over in the playoffs. So yeah, you want to really, really try to get those 1 and 2 seeds. And those hammers are going to be the way that you do that. I like to get a guy like Brees Hall or Bijan Robinson because I think they're going to probably hold value year over year, and they have that ceiling that they called like the top running back, cheat code. Like CMC last year was insane. If you had him on your team, you were in the playoffs, unless your team was absolutely garbage around him. But yeah, he carries those kind of players carry you into the playoffs, and they carry you to championships. So, Awesome Dumpling, he asked us this. He's like, "What is a hammer?" And we're kind of talking about guys that we think have a shot to be, top 2 or 3 wide receiver on the season. These are guys probably being drafted and redrafted in like the top 7 to 8 wide receivers. Probably ends around like AJ Brown, Puka Nakua, maybe Garrett Wilson. We kind of had this conversation, but the guys above them at wide receiver at least, we think are hammers, and those are guys that you want to have maybe 2 of those in a contender. But what do you guys think about the hammered conversation?
Yeah, I think a couple things I said there. I don't like to put a direct number on it necessarily, but for me, it's someone who, when healthy, is in my lineup no matter what, no matter who they're playing, what the matchup is. Then someone who has proven ability to win me a week and does have league winning upside in their range of outcomes. Not everybody gives you a league winning season, even if they can, but I just want that to be a possibility. The more of those guys you have, the better.
Yeah, and we also really wanna differentiate between, like, in a start 9, for example, I care a lot more about the number of elite players that I have. I mean, sure, I would love to have my wide receiver room be Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase in any league, right? But I really wanna make sure that I have one of those types of guys in a start 9. But in a start 11, if my best wide receiver is a little bit lower down the rung, I'm more okay with that because if I have 5 wide receivers from wide receiver 7 to, like, 20, that usually will help me compete because my lowest wide receiver should be maybe a little bit above where their lower wide receivers are, and I can catch up at quarterback, tight end, running back potentially as well. So just knowing like the distribution of the points being spread out over more players makes the individual studs slightly less important, although we still absolutely want to have them, less likely to overpay for them perhaps in that situation. That being said, I kind of agree with David's assessment there. It's a guy that I mean, it's just realistically speaking, we've been playing fantasy long enough where you look at someone's lineup and you're like, "Oh, shoot, I'm going up against this guy this week. That player, I'm scared I might lose this matchup simply because of them." Like those are kind of like the hammer type of guys. Like you know them because you're scared of playing against them is kind of a big part of it. And what I'm looking for in how do I know that it's time to stop rebuilding? Kind of going back to our community question answers, really getting the lay of the land is very important for me. So I want to look at 2 things. One thing, the first thing is how many other rebuilders are there? Like if there are 3 people who are already starting to rebuild for the next year that have already been collecting like longer than me, like I had all the 2024 4 picks, for example, but somebody already has 325 picks, another team has 325 picks, so half of them are off the table. I'm probably going to start pushing my chips in at least partially and going into that sexier, like younger build of people where I'm going to be a fringe playoff team if I can't go all the way to competing at the very least, because I don't want to be competing for the scraps in the next draft class. I would rather go for like a young build at this point. And the other thing is if there is only like one team that I'm sure is going to get a bye, or perhaps even like there's no team that I'm sure this is the absolute best team in the league, then I'm also very likely to assess and say it's time to just try to pull out of this rebuild. So if either of those two things are true, like a very even top or a very like consolidated two or three teams on the bottom, those kind of will help make me make that decision as well as assessing my team like David said earlier. And then as far as the moves that I'm looking to try to make, I want to make that decision as early in the offseason. I kind of gave the example of RB bets that I like to take, but also like before the NFL draft is a good time to start trying to buy like aging wide receivers like a Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins type. And every year there's new guys that fit along the line. Sometimes they're the same guys year after year. Like last year it was Tyler Lockett. You could still say Tyler Lockett this year. Like I don't know if I believe in him personally, but you could have said it was DeAndre Hopkins last year and it's still DeAndre Hopkins. So those old wide receivers used to be wide receiver ones or wide receiver twos that just you can try to inquire on all of them cheap and just buy the one that people are willing to sell you. Get those guys is a thing that I like to do to see if I can pull out as well. I don't usually care that much about getting my roster there all at once. I am usually okay if I feel confident in all but one of my starters, but I have a lot of pick flexibility. I'm very okay with going into the season with 8 starters out of my 9 that I feel pretty confident in, and a couple first round picks and a couple second round picks, and just seeing how I'm doing. I like to look over my competition for the first few weeks of the season. If I know that I'm playing the 2 rebuilders the first 2 weeks of the season, I'm a lot less likely to plug my holes right now. I'm a lot more likely to say, I'm pretty much guaranteed to go 2-0 because this team doesn't have any quarterbacks and this team doesn't have any running backs, for example. So, like, if you look at that, you can then know I'm going to go 2-0 and I'm going to see who's 0-2 and try to buy from them to actually turn into a competitor from a rebuilder. So, I really try to make the moves either as early as possible or I try to wait as long as possible because either I want to get the cheap prices at the beginning of the season or just continue prying on those like type of veteran players and the potential type of hammers people might want to move off of, or I want to try to like make the moves in season because in season you can get hammers that people don't yet view as hammers, like a Rashad White or Kyron Williams last year. People, if you're willing to move in, or even a Puka Nakua last year, if you're willing to move in on players who are giving truly elite production before people have seen a large enough sample size, you can also get a really good deal. So I do like to try to be patient in that process of turning from a rebuilder into a competitor or try to do it really early on is kind of my thoughts.
I love the DeAndre Hopkins kind of target. I think Deontay Johnson is one of those guys too. Those kind of guys you pay like wide receiver 4 prices for, and they can be your wide receiver 4 or 5, and they can give you that mid to low wide receiver 2 production. I love that point there because having one of those guys on the end of your team at a cheap cost, I think that really helps your winning chances here when you turn into a contender.
The point about looking at your early season schedule is really smart. It's something I actually never really thought about, but it does tell you whether or not you need to be aggressive right before the season or if you have a little leeway to, like you said, gain more information and figure out who some of these surprise hammers are going to be.
Sorry, David, that advice was for the listeners, not for you though. You shouldn't start doing it. All right. And so now we're going to go ahead and we are going to move along from our kind of how do we try to transition and how do we identify to when to transition to some actual kind of trade conversations to just get a gauge on what moves we would be willing to make if we are kind of pulling out of that rebuild into trying to contend. And I will go first with David. And I'm going to throw this one up here. A 12 team start 10. We see Kenneth Walker for a 25 first and a 26 third.
Yeah, just kind of starting off with a softball here, but it really fits into the conversations we've been having. We're trying to sell a running back who's going to produce and we're getting future value. I think we probably would all take this for just the 25 first. The 26 third is a nice cherry on top. For me personally, at least I'm taking any 25 first for Kenneth Walker if I'm rebuilding, but especially if it's not like a top 2 or 3 team in the league.
Can't disagree. He is below that bar I think we'd set for paying a 25 first for them. And JP, Russell Wilson or 25 second?
And this fits perfectly into the conversation I was having about selling guys that I think could be out of a starting job next year. And what you've said, Justin, about mitigating risk. I'm going to take the second. Obviously, Russell Wilson is older and we're rebuilding here.
I might actually take Russell Wilson if I think it's a late second, but if I think it's a playoff team second, I think it's a pretty high upside bet. I could understand going both ways on that. That's kind of like one of those that I was talking about with Zamir White almost, if I think it's a late second, that if I can gain enough value, if somehow he has a resurgence, it might be worth taking, but it's probably a stupid bet, and I probably should reconsider it. David, 12 teams start 11, one tight end premium, Pitts or Hack'em Sock'em Robot, TJ Hawkinson, and a 26 first.
Yeah, this one I think is pretty interesting when you think about it from a rebuilder perspective. Kyle Pitts is a great target for a rebuilder. He's young. His situation should be improving where he might even be able to establish himself as a tier one tight end going forward. But I'm going to take the package here. We've talked about Hawkinson as a great target for a rebuild a couple times this episode, and you're getting a 26 first on top of it. I just think that package is too good to pass up, even for the shiny name of Kyle Pitts there.
And last one, a couple Los Angeles wide receivers from different teams, Cooper Kupp and Blake Corum for Lad McConkey and Malik Washington in a 12-team start 10, JP.
Now, I know that here I am rebuilding, but I know where Blake Corum's market value is and where Cooper Cup. I don't think Cup is valued that much lower than McConkey, so I'm probably just gonna hold Cup and Corum, and I'm probably gonna seek out another deal, try to do a little bit better, maybe instead of Malik Washington getting something like a third or two thirds.
I was thinking the same thing. If you gave me a cash price for Washington of a third, I'm much more likely to do that because Malik Washington is just another wide receiver buried on a depth chart that we don't expect much from. So I really think you're right there. And so, just some ideas on trade prices in actual rebuilding leagues. If you have any trade questions for what you should sell for at a rebuilder, ask them in the comments below. We will get back to you on all of them. Please include as much team context, so number of starters, any scoring format, who are your key players, etc., number of picks you have. The more information you give us, like if you write 2 paragraphs, we'll give you 5 back, basically. So the more information you give us, the more we'll be able to tell you and prognosticate and give you better advice. And we love nothing more than giving you all advice. So thank you for joining us for another episode of the Dino Construction Podcast. We hope this was helpful for you as it was for us. Please remember to like and hit that subscribe button wherever you view or listen. And from all of us here at the Dino Construction Podcast, until next time.